everyone. We're here today with block 7 of our 2020 quilt. So today's block we're going to be dealing with angled rectangles and flying geese. You've made both of these units in previous blocks, but I am going to be showing you a different way to do the flying geese this time. So again, this block is going to be made up, if I can show you, of 4 units like that. Each unit is going to consist of 1 angled rectangle and 1 flying goose. So we're going to sew these 2 units together and make 4 of them and give them a quarter turn in order to create our block. So on our pattern, we start with making the angled rectangles. And again, you've done this in the past. The one thing I want to point out is making sure that when you follow these directions, that you're making sure that your angle is going in the correct direction. Okay, so I have 3 of them already made up here, right? So I took my square, I sewed it corner to corner. Actually, I'm going to go like this. I took my square, sewed it corner to corner. I'm going to iron it open. Make sure I can trim it up by, if I need to, I can flip it over to my back. Make sure I can trim off anything so that it's all the same size as my original rectangle. And then I can come back and trim off a 1/4 inch away. So they would end up looking like this. Okay. What you want to be careful of is when you have this square and you've drawn your line, you want to make sure that it goes from the bottom corner up to the center. Okay? What you don't want is for it to go from the top corner down to the bottom. Okay? When I go to iron it, it's going to look like it's correct, but actually for when we go to put our blocks together, my angle is going to be in the opposite direction that I want it to be. You can see I have a mirror image going on here. So when we get to putting our 2 units together, our flying goose with our angled rectangle, I'm going to come back to these and show you how this would create the wrong look. Okay? Then we're going to move on to our flying geese. So last time we dealt with a flying goose where we took a rectangle. We took 2 squares, drew a line on our squares, sewed directly on that line, and then trimmed a 1/4 inch away. Okay, so we have our flying goose. What that does is you end up with a lot of scrap that you end up throwing these little corners into the garbage can. Now, if you're making just a couple flying geese, it's not a big deal. Or if you're making really tiny ones, it doesn't add up to be a whole lot of fabric. But here I have a sample. If I was making big flying geese, okay, and I put my squares on and I sewed on my corners and I ironed them open to get that big flying goose, when I come back and trim away a 1/4 inch from that sewing line, I would end up having this much fabric on both sides that's just going to get thrown in the garbage can. Now, I know there's a way that you can go from this line and sew a 1/2 inch away and create a second half square triangle. We're not going to go into that today. That's a whole nother video. Okay? But there is a method that I'm going to show you now where you can create 4 flying geese at a time, all different sizes, without any waste. All right. So included in today's video downloads is going to be this chart. And today we're going to be working with this method, the draw, stitch, and cut method. So it's kind of similar to the way we've been doing the half square triangles, where you would draw a line, stitch on either side, and then cut them apart on the line. Okay, there's a chart included in here for all the different sizes of flying geese, going from finish size 1 by 2 all the way to a finish size that is 5.5 by 11. So this chart's going to give you those dimensions. For this project, we're always going to be dealing with the 2 by 4 finish size. And so for that size, we're going to be cutting one large square that's at 5 1/4 and 4 small squares that are 2 7/8. Now sometimes finding those lines on a big ruler can be kind of difficult. You don't know, where you're looking. So for those of you that like rulers or have this ruler, this is my favorite ruler to use for this process. And I'm just going to try to lift it up here a little bit. I flip my paper over so you can see it. So it's called the Flying Geese x4 No Math Ruler by the Lazy Girl Company. And the way this ruler works is I find the size of my block that I want it to finish to. So in this case, again, it's the 2 by 4, and it has a letter associated with each size. So with my solid lines, I would cut one square using those lines, and this line would give me that 5 1/4, which was on my chart. Then for my small ones, I'm going to turn the ruler. I'm going to find the same letter that I used over here, so that was letter F, working with the 2 by 4 unit, and I'm going to follow the dotted line to cut out my 4 small squares. So that's going to give me that exact 2 7/8 inch square without having to fight with all those lines on my bigger ruler. So again, if it's something that you're interested in, we do have it on our website. It's a great ruler, and it gives you multiple sizes all on at one time. So for whichever method you've used to cut out your pieces, you're going to have your one large one, and I'm going to have my 4 small ones. Okay. I've already drawn the line on these. I don't know, it might be a little hard to see because of the dark fabric. So what I need to do next is to take 2 of the squares, place one in the corner with my line going diagonally, and then I'm going to take a second square and lay it right on top. So I want that diagonal line to just continue down all the way across. Okay. And then I need to go to my machine, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away on either side of that line. Okay. You want to be careful to stitch a very exact 1/4 inch, or even a scant 1/4 inch is going to help with this process. Because we are cutting them at that exact 2 7/8, you don't have a lot of wiggle room when you're squaring them up. So I'm going to go to my machine. Again, I'm going to start right at my corner. I'm going to stitch down. The first line I stitch, I like to have this one be on top, so as I'm stitching, I'm just pushing it down. If I have it set up the other way, as I'm stitching along, it's going to want to catch this little end and flip it up. So if I do it this way the first time, at least when I flip it around, it's kind of already stable down, and I won't hook the second one quite as much. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch on either side of the line of the half square triangle. All right, so here we are at the sewing machine. Again, I'm going to put my square with my 2 little squares, and I'm going to have that line being going directly under my blade. And I've just put 2 pins in to help hold them in place. And I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to sew the other side. the second time I just have to make sure that my little point doesn't flip up on me, but it helps to have secured it down going the other direction the first time. Alright, so now I have my line sewn on 1/4 inch away from my drawn line. I have stitched 2 lines. So now we're going to go back to the cutting table and cut them apart. So here I have my 2 halves. So I cut it apart right on the line, and then I took it to my ironing board and I've ironed up the small squares towards the top. So it's kind of giving me these 2 little heart-shaped looking pieces. Okay, so now I need to take my remaining 2 small squares, and on each one of them I'm going to place that diagonal line going from the bottom up into the center of where my first 2 were, and it is going to be overlapping by a good 1/4 inch, maybe even a little bit more. So again, I'm going to take this, I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch, a scant 1/4 inch on either side of that line, and then we're going to be cutting those apart again on that line. So now I'm going to be sewing again that scant 1/4 inch with the line directly under my blade. And as I get to the top, what I'm aiming for is to stitch right at that point where those 2 pieces intersect. So again, I'm aiming for that intersection right where my top square overlaps with my lower square. And then when I cut them, when I start out going in the other direction, I'm going to butt this little intersection right up tight to my needle. So that's going to help me to have that starting and stopping point be exactly where I want them to be. We're going to cut them apart right on the line. And now when I go to iron these open, there's my flying geese. I'm going to have 4 of them without having to trim anything off and throw away that little corner. So I'm going to go iron them and then we can trim. All right, when I square these up, I like to use that long bottom edge of my flying goose, get that 2.5 line on there, and get my 4.5 line lined up with my corner. And I'm just going to trim off these little extra tips. Okay, can give it a turn and do the other side. This is where sometimes if you didn't hit that accurate scant 1/4 inch or the starting stopping point, these little wings can be a little off. Again, as long as it's not really off by a lot, if you're within that 1/8 of an inch, it'll still be caught in your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then what you're also looking for is to have that 1/4 inch seam allowance above the tip of your goose. If when you're trimming these up and you have that 2.5 here and the edge of one of your corners is off a little bit, as long as you're, maybe an 1/8 an inch or less off, it'll be fine because you're going to be dealing with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can kind of fudge it a little bit. All right, so now that we have all of our pieces that we're going to be working with, so we have our 4 flying geese and we have our 4 angled rectangles. Now we're ready to sew our units together. Okay, and again, we were dealing with putting that flying goose and that angled rectangle. And you have to make sure that you have things oriented in the right direction. So for this one, I want my angled rectangle. So the angle to be in that bottom corner. And then I want to take my flying goose, and if you think of this as the arrow pointing towards my angled rectangle. Now, if you remember earlier, I had showed you the one piece where I had sewn in the wrong direction. If I had all my pieces sewn this way, when I go to sew them together, I'm not going to get the right configuration for the block that I want. I may be creating a different block, which is fine, but it's not going to work out the way that this block is. So again, when you're making those angled rectangles, you always have to really pay attention to which direction that diagonal line is being sewn. All right, so I'm going to sew my flying goose onto my angled rectangles, and I'm going to make 4 of them. When I am sewing, I like to have my flying goose on top, and as I sew, I like to try to make sure that right where these 2 lines are intersecting is I try to get my needle as close as I can to stitching right at that point. That's going to keep my flying goose, the point of that flying goose, nice and crisp so it's not too far away, but it's not cut off either. The other thing you have to be careful is when you sew that you make sure you sew on the point side of your flying goose and not on the bottom. If I accidentally take it and grab it and put it under my machine this way, when I open them up, I'm going to be going in the wrong direction. Okay? And this is where I want to try to get that intersection to hit right where I'm going into the groove of my foot. Again, double checking, I have my flying goose pointed at my angled rectangle. Whoops. See, I almost accidentally put this one on top, and if I had sewn that together, I would have had it wrong. I need to be going this way. Those are the things that happen when you're in a rush. Wouldn't have been a big deal, could have just taken it apart, but it's just frustrating, especially if you do a whole bunch of them wrong. All right, so I'm back now with my 4 units. Now we're ready to assemble it into our block. So we always want that corner of our angled rectangle to be pointing towards the center. So I'm just going to be doing a 1/4 turn each time. Okay. So we're going to sew your 2 top units together, sew your 2 bottom units together, and then be sewing it together with 1 seam down the middle. This is a sample of my finished block. And just to look at our other colorways, this was my red and white block. This was my 12 fet quarter group. And this was the block I made out of my stash and my scrap.